I have been dwelling on Jesus' parable about the fired manager for the last 4 months. In an instant, the shock of losing everything seizes him. A sense of inadequacy, worthlessness, and humiliation confronts us when we do not have enough to provide for those we love. Now, this kind of terror might be completely foreign to you. It may have come and go in different stages of your life. Or you may be in the grips of this very fear right now and wonder how you might be able to escape from it. We often talk about inequality without spelling out what it really means. In our society, we tolerate a greater amount of insecurity and fear than in other advanced democracies. Not having adequate health care, housing, food, education, and even leisure time creates terrible and unnecessary suffering for millions of people. In America, racism has always been part of this story. Treating some people as less than human has made us callous to the pain of others. People often ask me a very straightforward question in which I almost never answer. As a matter of fact, I never do. This may be the first time I've gone on record with the answer for this question. People say, "Why do your parents live in Florida?" And I wonder that all the time. Sometimes they probably wonder the same thing. But the reason is quite simply that during the last years of his employment, a younger woman was being abused by my father's boss, and my dad publicly stood up for her, and as a result, he lost his job, and he lost the pension benefits that he was going to depend on. For every remaining year of his life, he will continue to pay a substantial price for having acted righteously. And their small Florida town, it's just a cheap place to live. Jesus' story is similarly about a turning point in someone's life. It is about a man forced to look back at his past as he faces an uncertain future. A manager caught squandering his boss's wealth gets fired. Afraid that he will fall into poverty, he acts quickly. Before the owner can get the word out, the manager cancels his client's debts in the hope that one day they may be able to repay him. Now, it seems strange, but this owner regards the manager's boss regards this behavior as clever, and Jesus agrees. He says, quote, "For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light." And Jesus goes on. He says, "I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth." Augustine, the 4th century African saint, writes, "I can't believe this story comes from the lips of our Lord." And we agree. And we immediately set to work on explaining it, justifying it, domesticating Jesus so that he won't interrupt our life. But Jesus will not sit down and be silent. Perhaps we feel offended because Jesus says, "Be like that manager," and we can't help but think that we already are. We're better than that. If we were laid off, we wouldn't walk out of the office with office furniture or give away company property to friends so that they'd help us later on. We long for a simple explanation of this story that doesn't complicate our life. And Jesus does not care that this is how we feel. Jesus passionately desires that we will draw closer to God. Now, the biblical scholars who've studied this also, they have the same kind of desire for a simple answer that we have. They want to explain the story away. Some say that it's hyperbole, it's an exaggeration. Others say that that the manager was really working for a kind of crime lord boss, that the owner of the things was so horrible that the manager was kind of stealing from the rich and giving to the poor. Other people say that the steward was just giving away the commission that he would ordinarily expected. But each of these explanations, each of them designed to make us feel more comfortable, But I believe Jesus is challenging us. Three things in particular stand out about his words this morning as Jesus speaks about money and about the future. First, I want to point out that Jesus simply talks about money more often than we do. I read somewhere that in the Gospel of Luke, 1 out of every 7 of Jesus' sayings has to do with money. Jesus seems consistently more concerned about it than about friendships, sex, marriage, politics, government, war, family values, truthfulness, or church. Jesus, more wisely than most of us, recognizes the power of money. I sometimes wonder if people who believe only in mere material things but do not believe in God, I sometimes wonder if they talk about money more, think about money more than spiritual people. Jesus would say, though, that they are both wrong. Both materialists and Christians underestimate the effect that money has on our soul. Materialists fail to recognize the existence of the ultimate and deeper meanings, and Christians fail to see how money is related to that deeper meaning. So Jesus says some radical things about money. He understands the temptation that we feel to live for accumulating money and the things that it can buy. Now, with regard to the gospel and money, there's two things I want to say. The first is something I'm not completely sure about, and the second is one that I am very sure about. Now, the first thing that I want to talk about is, it seems to me that in the Gospel of Luke, whenever Luke refers to money, it's always tainted. Luke calls it mammon, and that word includes everything that you have which has a cash value. There's something for him that is already corrupt about mammon. And we all tell stories to justify why we have money and someone else does not. We all may feel equal in God's eyes, but money substantiates that difference between a person with power and a person without it. I've been reading Theodore Dreiser's book, American Tragedy, and the tragedy that is ostensibly about is a murder, but the true tragedy is that American society is filled with people who are so powerful that they are impervious to any kind of suffering, and there's a vast majority of Americans who are totally unstable in their life circumstances. Now, part of me wants to resist this idea that mammon is evil, to believe that money is simply neutral, the way that my economics professors taught me, that it only depends on the goodness of the things that you buy for it with it. But I think that Luke's point is that money has no history. We assume money has no history before we possess it. And in our culture, we have so many self-serving stories that justify our wealth. We often associate wealth with moral virtue as if it mostly came from hard work or intelligence or competence, etc. But by warning us about money, Luke reminds us of the truth. And this is the primary truth of all our life. All we have, and all we own, and all we are comes from God. Now, that's not to say that you should go out there and try to be poor. Money can solve problems. The vast majority of problems can be resolved by a particular dollar amount. Unfortunately, the solutions that money buys never last. Our problems, when they're traced back to their roots, are ultimately spiritual problems. 2, this brings me to my second point about money, the thing that I'm much more sure about. I believe that money connects the spiritual and the material. I know it's radical, but with Jesus, I am convinced that we can use our money to genuinely please God. My children use money in ways that genuinely please me, and they use money in ways that don't please me. And I think the same is true with our relationship with the Holy One. Now, whether money is inevitably tainted, as I believe Luke claims, or it's neutral, as my economics professors taught me, money is what makes ministry possible in so many ways. We can do God's work with money. We can make an amazing difference in the lives of the poor, the sick, the lonely, and the spiritually destitute through our use of money. True wealth does not come from what we receive or own, but from what we are able to give away. Now, on this miserably stormy day, as the winds blow through the trees in Huntington Park, we come to this wonderful sanctuary, this beautiful holy temple. And we look around it and we know that its history. This is one of the oldest churches in the Western United States. And it seems so permanent with these enormous stone columns. But this is a fragile institution. Every year, a large number of people have to give a large amount of money in order for us to keep going. There are not many places where you can make a gift that is used in a better way than it is here. Organized together, we visit the sick, the lonely, and the elderly. We teach children about God and introduce them to adults they can depend on. God changes lives right here. Now, maybe your money is honest, maybe it's not, but it does God's work at Grace Cathedral. The final thing that I believe Jesus says through the story has to do with time. I think the people of faith can sometimes be really passive. The reason that we do that is because we think that God will just take care of everything for us, and that what we do doesn't matter. Jesus emphasizes through this parable that we face so many turning points in our life. This manager feels the same kind of pressure that we feel here today. But instead of responding with a nostalgia for a stable past, instead of wallowing in his present misery, the manager acts decisively, and Jesus admires that decisiveness. The American poet Marie Howe wrote a poem about her brother dying of AIDS called "The Last Time." The last time we had dinner together in a restaurant, he leaned forward and took my two hands in his hands and said, "I'm going to die soon. I want you to know that." And I said, "I think I do know." And he said, "What surprises me is that you don't." And I said, "I do." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Know that you're going to die." And he said, "No, I mean that you are." When it comes to money, most of us act as if we don't know that we are going to die. And Jesus' story is not just about how we are spending our money. It's about how we're spending our lives. And perhaps the deeper point is that this world in which we spend ourselves to impress others or protect our ego is passing away. In this life, we have a singular opportunity to spend ourselves shrewdly for the sake of God's kingdom. So the story of the unjust manager may not make complete sense to us just yet. But this parable reminds us that a feeling of entitlement and superiority comes along with our money, and that this can isolate us from God and from other people. Jesus' story also shows us the connection between the spiritual and the material, that God is more pleased by what we give than by what we get. And finally, it awakens us to the truth that Jesus' promise is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. You cannot buy the future. It will never belong to you. But you can act confidently because the future belongs to God. I think this is what my father did when he helped his coworker. And I wonder sometimes what effect that sacrifice has had on her life over the years. And this is what Jesus himself did. Even on the way to the cross, he trusted God completely. No home on earth will ever feel completely comfortable or safe because we were made to draw near to God.